All right, I think we are live. So, hi everyone. My name is Kyle Heitman, and I am the Climate Change Migration Focal Point at the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. Before we begin, I want to thank the people who made this event possible. So, first and foremost, thank you to our panelists who agreed to be here on just the most hilariously short notice imaginable. And we had a 1 week turnaround time, and everyone here is working with that. So thank you all. I also want to highlight the contributions of Chiara Schissa and Alonso de Ita for helping to put the panel together, selecting questions from the chat, and in Alonso's case, solving the logistical challenge of connecting 7 people on different continents all through my computer and then broadcasting the whole thing live to Facebook. Alonso and I live in different countries, and he still pulled this off. So thank you, Alonso. And finally, I want to give a quick shout out to Marta Varani for getting the ball rolling on this and for her institutional support in making this event happen. So without further ado, allow me to introduce the panelists and explain how this webinar will work. So first we have Mariam Traore, the International Organization for Migration's senior expert in migration, environment, and climate change. Next is Kaylee Ober, a senior advocate at Refugees International, as well as their program manager, for the Climate Displacement Program. We also have Dr. Susanna Villani, herself a lecturer in the University of Bologna's Department of Political and Social Sciences. Moving on, we are joined by Sofia Chiani, youth advisor on climate change to the UN Secretary General and the founder of Climate Cardinals. Then we have Zanaji Artis, co-founder and policy director at 0 Hour. And last but not least is Naisha Mallet, the climate justice youth leader at Uprose. Once more, thank you all for being here today. Now, to briefly explain today's event, instead of having each panelist prepare a written presentation, I will be asking everyone 2 pointed questions about their work and experience. Full disclosure, the speakers have seen these questions, but we're hoping that this format will keep things dynamic for our viewers. There will be time for open questions at the end. If anyone in the audience has something they want to ask, please type it in the Facebook comments. Alonso and Chiara will curate a selection and send them to me, or Chiara will read them live, or both, most likely both. We've reserved 1 hour for this panel, and there is every chance it goes long. It's a UN panel, they do that. So if you have to leave before the end, don't worry. We are theoretically, we hope, recording this, and we'll make the video publicly available. With that being said, let's dive in. So my first question is for Dr. Villani, and it is this. Given the lack of a legal category for climate migrants, how do you think international law has to evolve in order to protect them? Could you elaborate a little bit on what that evolution would entail?
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for the opportunity of being here, and thank you to the panelists and the organizers of this event. I think that for answering to your question, first of all, I think it's important to mention a point that you have actually mentioned in your question, that is a problem of definition. Because from a legal point of view, you know that definitions are important. And I find, first of all, that the current lack of the opportunity to categorize environmental or climate migrants is due also to the lack of a definition, of a clear definition about who a climate migrant is or environmental migrant is. And I'm distinguishing these 2 categories of persons exactly because I think that it's important also to think about this concerning the problem of categorization, because generally we think about climate refugees or climate migrants in general terms. But I think, personally, I think that it would be better to speak about environmental migrants. And environmental because the notion is broader than climate migrants. Climate migrants mean just those leaving their country or their territory because of the effects of climate change. But I think that also from an analysis coming from field visits and so on, I think that often people leave their territory for environmental, in a broader definition, issues. So it can be linked, for example, to fast onset events like earthquakes that are not strictly linked to climate change, clearly, but are natural issues. Or, and I think this should be a point to stress, the effects of the human activities that change environment. So this is the reason why I think that from a definitory point of view, it would be better to speak about environmental migrants and migrants, not refugees, exactly because, as we know, at international level, the international organizations and not only also academics think that to make this kind of persons in moving, okay, within the category of refugees is not appropriate. It's not appropriate because at the moment, the category of refugees, we know that according to the Geneva Convention, is linked just to a specific category of person leaving their territory because they are pushed by by a government conduct in particular, because is again the human, the government in more specific terms that make this person live in their country. So it's not an objective situation of environment. So again, I think that it is important to speak about migrants. And what are the future scenarios, in my opinion? Well, since, as I said, and I think this is correct, that the Refugee Convention cannot be extended in its scope of application at the moment, I think that it would be better to rely on other instruments of protection. This is made clear also in the very recent EU migration plan that has been adopted yesterday. It was published yesterday, wherein the issue of climate change is included, is considered a push factor for migration flows, but actually no reference to environmental migrants or refugees is made. This because it cannot be strictly linked to asylum policies. But in particular, I think, also reading this plan, it can be better linked to other instruments, as I said and anticipated, in particular, instruments linked to human rights protection, generally speaking. More than, I think, as well, subsidiary protection or humanitarian visas, because I know, and you know, I think that to grant subsidiary protection or humanitarian visas is very, very difficult, because there are standards, high-level standards, in particular for subsidiary protection, where, according to what is written in the different instruments, it's difficult to apply to climate events or environmental events. And humanitarian visas are quite complicated to grant. Also, at supranational level, we can say, in according to a broader and supranational interpretation, as we know at EU level, for example, because states want to keep the power to grant humanitarian visas. So I think that it's quite complicated to establish, to create a unique framework at supranational level concerning this point. So I think, again, that it would be more suitable to open the doors to a broader interpretation of the instruments concerning human rights. And I'm saying this also because it has been done in a recent, and we will talk about this, in a recent decision of the UN Committee on Human Rights concerning the interpretation of the right to life and the principle of non-refoulement. This is, I think, that is the best way to think about the future of environmental migrants in this sense, and to guarantee a sort of protection to these people at the moment. This is my point of view. If we want, we can also share these these opinions or not.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer. For here, I'm going to jump to Mariam. That was your answer, right?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Okay. So, Mariam, this one is for you. The IOM is well known for its role in global standard setting, such as through publications, task forces, and international accords. However, without regional, state level, and even municipal support, it is easy for sovereign governments to overlook or be outright hostile to these standards. In a recent Medium article, you wrote about the need to consider environmentally displaced people in all relevant lawmaking. With that in mind, what local and regional initiatives is IOM undertaking to ensure that consideration?
Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you so much. So indeed, my organization, the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, we are a global United Nations organization. So we work in different countries. I mean, we have hundreds of offices and we work in all regions of the world. So personally, I work mostly at the global policy level. And I'm very happy that I was able to participate in all of these discussions that maybe some of you have followed, that have concluded by including climate change and environmental factors in some important global policy processes. The first one being the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Task Force on Displacement, and the second one being the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. So essentially, these two frameworks gave us, for me, two main points. First, that countries need to focus on climate action so that people are not forced to migrate. So it's really about prevention of forced migration. Secondly, that there are cases where people will have to leave. There's no other way around it because climate impacts are too grave, and therefore you need to facilitate migration for these people. So coming to the regional and national level, for us, the goal is to support countries to align their national frameworks to this international, we can't really call them standards because it's not like they've been officially endorsed in a treaty or so on. But let's say that there's been a lot of negotiations around this, and many states agree that this is a decent way forward to address issues related to climate change, environment, and migration. So with that in mind, for us, working at the regional and national level, it means, first of all, working at the policy level, so supporting the states to develop regional frameworks that take into account climate and environmental factors. And I think that goes back a little bit with what Susanna was saying, because it is so hard to grant protection through existing legal frameworks, then we really try to support a more soft introduction of the topic. For instance, that states include climate and environmental factors when they negotiate free movement protocols in a given region. And we also work a lot at the national level with some countries. They approach us, they ask us for support to review their national policy frameworks. Either it's the national migration policy framework or it's the national climate change policy framework, in order to include provisions that relate to migration, so that we have, at least at the national level, a comprehensive way to approach these issues. Now, I have to say that this is all very recent work, because it's not been that long that climate change, environment, and migration is high on the agenda. So all of this is work in progress, and we'll have to see in a few years how this evolves. And obviously, beyond the policy level, my organization, but also many others, are working on projects and programs at field level. So you work directly with migrants, you work directly with communities, host communities, you can work with mayors, cities, and so on. You have all sorts of different types of projects, from helping migrants to train in specific areas related to the green economy. You do have different kind of field interventions, but it would be too long to go into that. My last point would be about youth. So the youth constituency has supported the development of this global framework, especially the Task Force on Displacement, linked to the UN Climate Change Framework Convention, because the youth members of this task force. So I think we have seen more and more integration of youth-related issue in these global discussions, but we are missing still that dimension at national and regional level. So that's maybe something for you to think of in terms of engagement. How do you bring more of this youth perspective? Over.
Thank you so much for your answer. So we have one more question that's thematically similar, and this one is for Kaylee. So Kaylee, arguably the most well-known gap in climate migration policy, and one your organization is intimately familiar with, is the complete lack of refugee protections for environmentally displaced people. In your view, why has this gap been left open? To what extent does the concept of migration as development fill this gap? And what can the international community do to fill it completely?
Thank you, Kyle. And also thank you, Susanna and Mariam, for kind of touching upon this topic. I'll do my best not to be repetitive, but I think it's for a variety of reasons. One, Susanna's already mentioned, the 1951 Refugee Convention does not mention climate change or environmental change within the definition of refugee. And so basically, it means that those who are displaced due to environmental change or climate change are not covered by this convention. So that's from a legal and normative standpoint, why this is not considered, or why people displaced by climate change are considered under the convention. But I think there's other reasons for that. One is also problems of attribution and calculation. We can't determine to what extent, or it's very difficult to determine to what extent climate change actually plays a factor in inducing someone to move. And so this would be, even if we were to include environmental change or climate change within the definition of refugee, it'd be very hard to determine that as the primary factor for why someone has moved. It also is due to kind of basis of reality. Most people that move due to environmental change or climate change will most likely move internally, so they won't cross the border. So again, they're not able to seek out protection from this refugee convention. And there's also more kind of political reasons, right? As Susanna mentioned, if you say someone moves because of climate change or environmental change, it kind of passes the buck. Most of the time, it's an issue of governance, which leads people to migrate, and we shouldn't depoliticize the factors behind this kind of movement. So, for example, the Syrian refugee crisis is often held up as kind of one of the first instances of those moving due to climate change. But in fact, there were long-standing policies in place that that actually pushed along bad policies that were related to drought. So, for instance, agricultural policies encourage growing water-intensive crops and the spread of inefficient irrigation methods, which led to aquifer overuse and growing water scarcity. And so the Syrian government also canceled state subsidies in the 2000s to liberalize the economy, which effectively multiplied the price of fuel and fertilizer for rural farmers. And so it made it very difficult to eke out a living for those rural farmers, especially when there was in the face of prolonged drought. And so it's not just a simple one-to-one equation of causation there, and it's often due to governance that people actually are forced to flee. And I think also on the political side, right, and especially from the side of someone who works on this issue, the label of climate refugee can be really contentious. And so one of the things is, aside from the definitional complications, is that climate refugees often brings up imagery of people from the global south moving to the global north. And that's inaccurate, right? We know from many studies that a lot of the movement will be internal, like I said, rural to urban mostly, and especially not to the global south, if anything, maybe to neighboring countries. And so we have to be careful with the words we use. And so climate refugees is not something that those that work on climate migration and displacement issues use because of that. I think it's also because we've done a very good job, and actually IOM has been a part of this, to say that, look, migration doesn't have to necessarily be something that's negative, right? A lot of people use migration as a way to spread risk, to seek out other sources of income that aren't as tied to the vagaries of weather. It's a way for people to send back remittances to family members back home in order for them to, weather the lean season or even rebuild after disaster. So migration can be a form of adaptation, or as you called it, Kyle, migration for development. And so I think in a lot of ways, this discourse developed because in direct response to the specter of climate refugee, and trying to make it a little bit more of a nuanced discussion that migrants are agents of change, and not just kind of vulnerable people that have no agency, and that also will be coming to the global north inevitably, right? And so I think we need to, discuss the fact that migration as adaptation is real, and it can be positive. At the same time, I think there's limitations to that. So I've done a lot of field work as part of my PhD in Thailand, and I think migration as adaptation is true for some, but not for all. So for instance, in the case of Thailand, the overall household might be more stable and have access to different sources of income, but the migrants themselves may be in a more precarious living situation, may be working in the informal economy or with a kind of temporary or limited contract, which doesn't give them the same types of workers' rights as a permanent permanent employee. And in addition to that, dependent on kind of gender, socioeconomic factors, education, there may be different expectations for each migrant. So for instance, the oldest daughter of each family is expected to send back more remittances than the oldest son if they both migrate. Likewise, the burden might be placed on the family back home. So in Thailand, the daughter often sends her children to her mother and father's house in the village which she's from, in order to take care of the grandchildren. This places an additional burden on usually the grandmother. So these are discussions we need to have. They need to be more nuanced, but there's limitations to both. And I also, just a caveat, because I work for a humanitarian organization, the word climate refugee, although is contentious, does speak to a general universal truth, which is climate change will be impacting the system in which we live, or already is impacting the system in which we live, to such a degree which we have never really experienced before in the past, that our past experiences or our studies based on the past might not be as accurate or all-encompassing as we believe. So I do believe that climate change, and in particular, really impactful, obvious low onset events like sea level rise, will displace large swaths of populations, and may force people to have to seek home outside of where they live. And we need to be realistic about this, and we need to figure out solutions to that. So I think the other half of your question, Kyle, was essentially, how can we do that? How do we fill this gap? Well, I think, IOM has done a lot of good work actually on this, and as part of the platform on disaster displacement, really what we're seeing is countries are more open to talking about displacement if we talk about it like around the framework of disaster rather than climate change, because climate change is such a political issue. And so the platform on disaster displacement has done a lot of very good work working with countries to use existing soft law to create protection for those who are displaced due to disaster. And a lot of this work has been successful at the regional level, with the support of IOM as well, to put together different, either more expanded definitions of refugee, like in Latin America, the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, and expanding that, or seeking out regional freedom of movement protocols, like they recently endorsed in IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is in East Africa and part of the Great Lakes. And so this is really the future. Essentially, it is much more, we'll see much more movement at the regional level than it would ever at the international level, because there are shared borders, there are shared understandings of economy and commerce, there are shared understandings of there's shared language, sometimes there's shared ethnicity. So it's much easier to come together to figure out solutions at the regional level in some cases than it is at the international level. So that's really the way forward at this point.
Great, thank you. That was really informative. So thank you for your insight. Quick reminder for the people who joined us later, if you have any questions, please type them in the Facebook comments and we'll get to them at the very end. So from here, I'm going to move on to Zanaji. So where am I? Right here. Sorry, I lost my spot on my script. So this is for Zanaji. So in our discussions prior to this event and online in your organization's platform, you refer to climate and environmental migration as being an issue of colonialism. Could you elaborate more on the linkages between climate migration and colonialism, as well as, in your view, what the international community should be doing to address this?
Yes, definitely. So thank you for that question. So first I'll start to talk a bit about Zero Hour and who we are. So we are a youth-led climate justice organization based in the US, and I co-founded the organization in 2017. And what's really special about our group is, one, it's youth-led, it's for youth. It recognizes that young people and kids are on the front lines of climate change and will be most acutely impacted by any issue of environmental justice, including climate migration. And the second is that in our platform, we name 4 different systems of oppression as the root causes of climate change. So those 4 are capitalism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. And we really think that those 4 are very intertwined. But for colonialism specifically, we talk about that in the context of being inherently tied to capitalism and the actions of industry. And so we know that climate change is a new wave of colonialism based on who in the world it's impacting. And so the global north, or what is considered the global north, the West, Europe, and the United States predominantly, are polluting the most out of anywhere in the world. And they are also going to face the least immediate impacts of climate change. While right now, we already know that in what's considered the global south, people are already being displaced either within their countries or among neighboring countries, as was mentioned before. But why is this happening? It's because of industry. It's not just the general population of these places. And of course, there are consumers who are consuming, we have our personal vehicles, we have the energy infrastructure, but it's really industry and the influence of industry and politics that has maintained that infrastructure and has maintained our reliance on the fossil fuel industry, which is important to recognize. And I also want to say, so many people, even here in the US, are already being displaced from wildfires on the West Coast right now, flooding in the Gulf Coast, and elsewhere in the US. And all of these natural disasters are being exacerbated by climate change. It's being caused by greenhouse gas emissions in the West. But even though we are seeing this internal displacement in the US, we know that impacts around the world for what is considered the global south are already much worse. We're seeing Pacific islands being swallowed by rising sea levels. We're seeing in the Arctic permafrost melt and impacts for indigenous communities where the ground is literally falling apart beneath them because of permafrost melt. And so entire ways of life are changing because of the fossil fuel industry and the impacts of climate change. And so we're calling that colonialism because it imitates what we understand about how settler colonialism happens in the United States. Of course, colonizers arrived in the United States, they displaced and murdered indigenous people here, and they tore people away from their homes and their cultures. And then that's exactly what we're beginning to see with climate change as it forces people to move, it displaces people around the world. And so that's why we like to name that. So for what we would like the international community to address is that one, we should recognize who the polluters are and the polluting industries that have maintained the system that we have right now. And also recognize that even if greenhouse gas emissions were to end today, climate change isn't going to stop there. We know that past pollution will continue to drive changes into the future. And we need to be taking proactive steps to ensure that people that are displaced by climate change have the support that they need. Because we know that the majority of impacts will be happening in the global south. And how is the global north, the countries that have driven most of that change, going to be supporting those people? Investing in adaptation is one option. We need to be preparing for this. It has to be proactive. We can no longer be reactive as we have been in the past to climate change. We should invest in adaptation infrastructure, prepare for what used to be considered 100-year natural disasters, 100-year floods. And also something that a few people have already mentioned is the sort of definition of what a refugee can be considered or what reasoning people can have to seek asylum. And I do think that environmental reasons should definitely be considered as a reason for people to leave their country of origin and seek support from another nation. So yes, that's my thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you so much for your insight. And unfortunately, here in the USA, I think we recently had an example of climate displacement as colonialism. And so I'm going to ask Naisha about that. So Naisha, your organization focuses heavily on issues affecting Puerto Ricans. And in 2017, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, migration from Puerto Rico to the USA mainland brought climate displacement in the Caribbean into sharp focus. And could you elaborate on how environmental migration impacts Puerto Rico and the Caribbean region specifically?
Yes, definitely. Thank you guys for having me. I'm so excited to be on this panel with you guys. You guys are amazing. So I will also just start off by just speaking a little bit about Uphold and what we do and who we are. Uphold is an environmental and climate justice organization located in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. We were founded in 1966. But we were founded in 1966. We transitioned into a climate organization in 1996 when my ED, Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, took position. We serve a very versatile community, many of which are Puerto Rican. This transition story is important because young people were the reason that prompted the change from a social justice organization to an environmental organization. They wanted to address the huge asthma problem within Sunset Park. They wanted to fight for their right to breathe, and our young people have been fighting ever since. Most importantly, we're an intergenerational organization, and we believe that everyone of all ages should be working together to address the climate justice issue. So yes, Caribbean countries in much of the global south contribute the least to climate change, but experience the brunt of the climate crisis. These countries are filled with Black and brown bodies who live a very basic and humbling life. They respect and tend to the land that they live on, and they should not have to worry about the damages done to the global environment by industries and greedy governments. For example, many countries, Caribbean countries, as climate continues to get worse, it means like a strength in their population size. The destruction done by Maria in Puerto Rico is a direct result of the U.S. history colonialism, extraction of land and labor, and corporate greed. 3 years ago, this past week, the Category 5 storm known as Maria caused 40 billion in damage and almost over 4,695 deaths, forcing 4% of Puerto Rico's population to migrate to the states. Months later, investors and developers wasted no time in exploiting the U.S. colonies, land, and its people's trauma, aiming to implement false solutions to promote an extractive economy. So an extractive economy is a term that we use to describe the political and the economic system that extracts the wealth from the land, workers, and its communities. This was happening to Puerto Rico while they were seeking to implement a just transition, and which is a framework we use that pushes the shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative one, and that is also just for all people. So a just transition will build the economy and the political power amongst the frontlines communities and allow us to address past harms and create new relationships of power for the future, and through reparations. A just transition describes both where we are right now and where we want to be and how we're going to get there. So when climate refugees from the Caribbean seek help from the countries that are responsible for a large percentage of the world's carbon emissions, including the US, they're not usually received with open arms. I really watched in awe, like as our current administration hesitated to waive the 1920 law, the Jones Act, that allowed only American ships to travel between the US ports. This caused a stall in the relief efforts for Puerto Rico, making it hard for the country to receive any resources to survive, sustain, and rebuild. So Puerto Rico's infrastructure was devastated by Hurricane Maria, and it's going to take years to rebuild and to reimagine. Climate migration is very hard on the individual going through it. This form of displacement can hold like a lot of trauma. Migrants often feel like they're abandoning their native communities, their families, their friends, leaving behind the life that they once knew. Those who stay face a different type of trauma that appears when they see that a lot of their community and the people around them disappearing. My mother, she migrated to America from an even smaller Caribbean island off the coast of Grenada called Carriacou. And in recent years, through just conversations with family members, I've heard a collection of just deeply rooted concerns regarding the changes that they have been experiencing on their own island. Within these conversations, members talked about, my family talked about seeing shorelines receding, certain areas that were once traditionally fishing waters during carnival season are now yielding less and less fish every year. I listened to the concerns of natives who watched as their beaches that they grew up on were privatized by private developers, with keep off signs saying that they can't come into, their own beaches, that that's a part of that their daily lives. These developers are building large hotels on shores lines, which we know in the long run will damage the land around it. So these are some of the many experiences that Caribbean people face, and many of the Caribbean countries receive most of their money through trade, tourism, development. So in order to compete with countries like the US, that have a more robust economy, they resort to dealing with exploitative companies and governments that take advantage of their economies and that often begin taking their land and selling it to other private developers. And they try to create relationships with people who they just want to extract their wealth. And this behavior reflects colonial times. Of the 43 million residents of the Caribbean, they contribute at least less than 1% of the global CO2 emissions. That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot that other countries are emitting, and they're not. It's less than 1%. One thing about migration is that the people who are leaving, they don't want to leave. They are forced to leave. So what happens to the place? What happens to Puerto Rico? What happens to these Caribbean islands when all their people have to migrate? What happens to their history? What happens to the culture? Who will take responsibility for that? Studies show that Puerto Rico's population could plunge below 2 million by 2040. That's a lot, you know. What happened to Puerto Rico can happen to any Caribbean country, can happen to my mother's country, can happen to the countries that my friend's family comes from. So I think it's important for me to express that because these are my people and this is my culture, and we deserve to be heard. We deserve the resources to start building for a climate adaptable future.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that answer. And I think in keeping with the theme of local impacts, this next question will be for Sophia. So thank you for your patience, Sophia. I know we're the last one on the first round. So you've spoken publicly about becoming invested in climate change when, as a child in your parents' native Iran, you were unable to see the stars at night due to pollution. And today it appears likely that the issue of environmental displacement will affect Iran both uniquely and disproportionately. Could you discuss both why that is and what could be done to help?
Yeah, definitely. And through my involvement in the climate movement, I've really seen that the Middle East as a whole is left out of discussions, which I think is a shame because as I learned, temperatures in the Middle East are actually rising more than twice the global average. And touching on my concerns in Iran, I mean, so I noticed as a child that the pollution was really bad. And over the past few years, it's actually gotten a lot worse. And last year, there were so many reports showing, 1,500 people were hospitalized over a period of just 24 hours because of air pollution. An Iranian environmental chief said that babies were dying because the air quality was so bad. And so this really is an environmental disaster. And then going to the issue of migration, climate migrants. So in Southeast Iran, there has been really horrible droughts for the past few years because of these factors. And so what people have been doing is, so these people in rural areas have been migrating to cities like Tehran, which are already very, very overpopulated and mismanaged. And so it's really contributing to this situation where people need to go somewhere, but they don't have anywhere to go. And so what they've been doing is they've been setting up these settlements on the fringes of large cities like Tehran, but the government hasn't liked that. And so they've actually been burning down the houses of the migrants who are settling on the fringes of cities like Tehran. And so it really has just become a disaster where you have these people who are being displaced, they don't have anywhere to go. And that's why we've seen that the rural population in Iran has actually been decreasing year after year. And it's a consistent theme. And I think the sad thing is that actually the Iranian government, they signed onto the Paris Climate Agreement. And so in terms of like what can be done, obviously we need to be tackling climate change because these climate change induced disasters are disproportionately negatively affecting these people in Iran. And so the Iranian government actually did sign onto the Paris Climate Agreement, but they haven't ratified it. And part of that reason is because of the crippling sanctions that have been placed on them by the United States government. And so the Iranian people are in a horrible spot. Obviously, they're being terribly affected by these environmental and climate problems, but then they also have this issue of a crippling economy where they really don't have resources to put towards this issue. And so this is where the like, what can we do aspect comes in, where the responsibility really is on governments like international governments to provide support to countries like Iran, because Iran is the 7th highest emitter of CO2 emissions. So they definitely are playing a part in exacerbating the climate crisis. And so if we really want them to be taking these progressive steps necessary to be lessening their impact, then we need to provide international support and not cripple their economy with sanctions.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And I mean, you just talked a lot about rural to urban migration and internal migration. And I think the next question, which is going to be for Kaylee, is going to cover this in greater detail. So Kaylee, in your report, Groundswell, Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, you assert that in 3 regions, so Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, 143 million people could be forced to move elsewhere within their own countries due to climate change. Could you elaborate on the problems faced by internally displaced climate migrants, the protections or lack thereof they have under international law, and what can be done to better address their needs?
Thanks, Kyle. I want to include kind of a caveat beforehand that we always need to be very careful with projections. So I was a part of this report that put together these projections, but it's put together using like responsible or at least recognized data like the shared socioeconomic pathway. So essentially projections into the future based on demographics and economics, then also overlaid with kind of different climate change mitigation scenarios. And then we come to a conclusion of different kind of scenarios of a future world. One that might be more sustainable, one that's business as usual and pessimistic, or one that's kind of in between. And the 143 million number is actually based on the most pessimistic scenario. So just so we're all on the same page. And it's also talking only about internal movement. And with our modeling, we're not able to determine how much of that movement will be, forced or voluntary in nature, because a lot of these kind of socioeconomic scenarios already take into account kind of rural to urban migration patterns that exist. And so we don't really know to what degree. So just so we're all on the same understanding. I think the second part of your question, though, is what kind of protection gaps are there for those people who might be moving internally due to climatic reasons? And so I think there's several things here. One, we have to distinguish between migration and displacement. So if you're displaced due to environmental change, let's say, or a disaster, you're afforded certain types of protections that you don't get if you're just considered a migrant. There are guiding principles for internally displaced people. People displaced by disasters are able to be under that umbrella of protection, but it is non-binding in nature, and it's up to each country and based on their own sovereignty, they have the ability to determine to what degree they take heed of those principles, and they also have to actively request from different organizations like UNHCR, for instance, or IOM, assistance and support if they have to seek it out, essentially because of the question of sovereignty. So I think the protection gap is myriad, but one is that we do have these guiding principles for IDPs, and in principle, those displaced by disaster should be able to fall under that kind of protection. Those who are migrants, categorized as migrants, because it is kind of a superficial distinction between kind of displacement and migration, to some degree, might not be afforded the same kind of rights. And we can see already within the political economy of the world that migrants are often vilified, and so aren't afforded any sort of protection, especially if they're moving to from rural to urban areas. We can see now during COVID-19 even that a lot of migrants are being forced back home, or at least not being provided for or taken care of by national governments when their livelihoods completely evaporate in cities because of lockdowns. We can see that in India, we can see that in Bangladesh. We can also see that governments that have a lot of migrant workers from abroad are sending migrant workers back home unceremoniously, like from Saudi Arabia back to Bangladesh, for example. So it's a very complicated issue, but I think there are a couple of ways in which we can address it, at least. One of those ways is to understand that climate change is our reality. Climate-induced migration will be our reality, is our reality, will be our reality. And so we need to at least understand some low-risk, high-reward things that we can do. And I think that's really about supporting migrants' rights in general. I think that's about understanding that a lot of people will be moving to cities and that we need to make them more sustainable, greener, more supportive of in-migrants, really supporting those communities in particular and involving them in the planning process, integrating them within the development and urban development and planning process. And so that would be a really easy way of affording at least them a seat at the table, ensuring that that those who are moving to cities aren't put into more precarious situations than they're leaving from, for example. What else can we say about that, Kyle? Am I answering your question, or is there an additional part that you think we need to go over?
You're answering the question, don't worry.
Okay, great. I'm sure I have other things to say. I don't have notes, but if I think of it, I will raise my hand.
Don't worry. I mean, we're going to keep a little bit on the idea of internal migration with the next question, which is going to be for Zanaji. And yeah, I mean, Kaylee, your answer was really informative. Don't worry. So Zanaji, this one's going to be for you, because you also pointed out in your last answer that climate migration will particularly affect Indigenous people. And I was wondering, could you talk more about how climate migration and Indigenous land rights are connected, and what gaps Indigenous climate migrants face when trying to seek justice?
Sure. So I will, yes, definitely. So I'm going to actually pull a little bit from Susanna's answer about how we're defining the issue, and sort of expand it more to all environmental issues, and hone in on the fossil fuel industry again. And so I'll just speak to the US first, because I am from here, but I identify as Indigenous, disclaimer. But I think here we've definitely seen displacement from the fossil fuel industry as a result of pipeline infrastructure. We've seen it in Alaska with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It runs across the entire state, from the northern coast to all the way to the south. And we've seen the impacts of that. There was the Exxon Valdez oil spill off the coast of Alaska. There have been oil spills elsewhere. The Indigenous people are fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Activism on the front lines in the US for water rights against the fossil fuel industry have often been led by Indigenous people. And it is because of that history of colonialism, because Indigenous people in the US have faced persecution and murder as a result of the extractive economy, as a result of corporate greed. And we know that even in the future as well, Indigenous people around the world will be impacted the most by climate change. And we're seeing that right now in the Arctic. So like I said, Alaska is one example, but in Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet is melting at a rate faster than most other places all over the world. And that will have major impacts on Indigenous livelihood there. And people are making their livelihoods off of the sea ice. They're making their livelihoods off of what they know to be the natural environment. And that is changing in a way that isn't possible for adaptation. And so they will be forced to move and learn new ways of living. And yeah, I mean that's what I would have to say to that, is that Indigenous people are on the front lines of the climate crisis. They have been for a very long time. There is a statistic going around saying that I believe Indigenous people around the world are protecting 80% or more of biodiversity on the planet. And so it is a major issue for them. And then I guess the second part of your question, what gaps are Indigenous climate migrants facing as they seek justice? Yeah, so I think that recognizing Indigenous rights in the US and around the world has been something that hasn't been successful, right? We are on Indigenous land, and treaty rights have historically not been honored. We've seen that with the fossil fuel industry. We've seen that with pipeline infrastructure. And so when we talk about then, now these people are going to be displaced by climate change, are we going to offer them new land rights? Are we going to, do some new treaty or expand what land they are entitled to because their native land is no longer habitable because of actions from the fossil fuel industry and from the U.S. government and governments around the world. And so that will be a problem, because how are we recognizing what land these people do have now, since their original land was colonized, and now we're facing this new wave of colonialism with climate change.
Great. Thank you for your answer. And again, it's very informative. So we're going to pivot once more, and I want to go back to Mariam. Yes, you are still here. Great. So we're going to go back to Mariam. So Mariam, and I think Kaylee kind of touched on this a little bit in her last answer. But due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, many states have either closed their borders or imposed severe travel restrictions, and this could have a devastating impact on climate migrants, who generally lack the ability to quote unquote stay at home. So moreover, because of insufficient international protections, environmentally displaced people are largely shut off from what resources are available to other migrant classes. And could you talk more about this specific issue, what IOM is doing to address it, and what you believe still needs to be done?
Thank you so much, Kailin. So I think indeed, looking ahead, I think with the first round of questions, we have pretty much established the scope of the issue. When we talk about climate change, migration, and displacement, we've seen that you can come at it from so many different ways. But what is reshuffling the cards now? It's this COVID-19 situation. I mean, there are many ways that the COVID-19 impacts and recovery will probably have an impact on climate migrants, but also all the policy discussions around it. Obviously, now we're still in a questioning mode. I mean, we can only imagine what will be the long-term impacts, but I think it's safe to say that this is the one issue that will impact all of our work, all of us who are working on this topic. We will have to deal with this. With its consequences. So I think for me, just to summarize very quickly, in terms of impact of COVID-19, obviously you see impacts on migrants themselves. It's probably the most important in terms of climate or environmental migrants. We see that people who are engaged in seasonal migration, let's say from the countryside to a city, who are part of labor migration schemes, for instance, where they migrate temporarily from one country to another. Well, these people have not been able to access these migration opportunities this year. So obviously we can imagine how much this will impact their daily lives, especially if they are already vulnerable to climate change impacts. Obviously you have you have more impacts on individuals. I mean, we have seen in some countries, including Vanuatu, for instance, that are at risk of natural disasters, that there is a contradiction between social distancing measures that are needed to protect people from the pandemic and, let's say, evacuation orders or help for people displaced by natural disasters, because obviously they usually come together in shelters or other similar kind of place where if one person is sick, then obviously it's easy for the disease to spread. So there are all sorts of examples like this. On a bigger picture level, I'm concerned personally by the disruption to the climate change and the migration global policy agendas. There were a number of discussions supposed to take place this year and next year. These discussions, they do help advance overall action that help people in the field. Although it seems very often when we engage in these policy discussions that there is that the end goal of supporting people is far away. But you do need to have these policy discussions first if you're going to get the adequate resources and political buy-in to have an impact in the field. So when these discussions are not happening at the global regional level, then it delays action in the field because it's difficult to secure funding to develop programs, and it can also create a sense of that the issue is not as important anymore, because we are all in a state of emergency trying to respond to COVID-19 crisis. The last thing I will say on that is that there is an opportunity for me here. In the last, let's say 5-6 years, I've seen more and more that the health sector, health policymakers, health practitioners are interested in the impacts of climate change and migration on health. So I've seen these discussions are happening more and more. There are more and more panels, research, people involved trying to develop projects, but it was still not, for me, the issue was emerging, but it was not firmly on the agenda. But with the COVID-19 pandemic and the obligation we all have now to integrate this dimension in our work, I feel that there is a lot more space to really think through the climate change, health, and migration nexus. Think, what does it mean, especially for indigenous people, like I've heard, what does it mean in terms of policy, and also what does it mean just not in terms of physical health. I think I really like what Nyesha said about the trauma and the mental health impacts, which is often forgotten. So here is our opportunity to really think through about how all of these things connect and what we need to do at policy and operational level to answer these new challenges. Thank you, Kylie.
And thank you. So as a quick heads up, we have hit 1 hour. So there are 3 questions left for Naisha, Sophia, and Susanna. Do any of the 3 of you have to leave right now?
I do.
Sophia?
I can see.
Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and jump to Sophia, and then we'll come back to Naisha and then end with Susanna. So Sophia, where is your question? There it is. So Sophia, your organization, Climate Cardinals, aims to translate climate reports and other related environmentalist literature into languages less commonly spoken. Given that climate displacement is likely to disproportionately affect Indigenous groups and minority populations, how could lack of access to information negatively impact potential environmental migrants, and what can the international community do to expand that access?
Yeah, and so before segueing into that question, I'll just quickly answer one of the audience questions. So people are not migrating to cities because of polluted skies. Obviously, the cities are more polluted. The reason why they're moving is because, like I was talking about, in southeast Iran, there have been horrible droughts for the past few years. And then last year in southwest Iran, there was horrible floods. And so because of these disasters, obviously people lack resources. Their houses have been destroyed. They can't live in these rural areas anymore. And like Kaylee was talking about, there's also obviously more economic opportunities in these cities. So it makes sense for them to move there, even though it is a lose-lose situation because they are going into a more environmentally hazardous environment. And then in terms of the work that Climate Cardinals is doing, so we are a youth-led international nonprofit with over 6,000 volunteers in 41 countries around the world. And so we're working to translate climate information into over 100 languages. So as I've been talking about this entire time about the environmental and climate issues in Iran, what I realized is when I brought up my concerns with my relatives about what was happening in Iran, they didn't even know what I was talking about. They didn't know what climate change and global warming were. And there's actually like research that backs this, where only 5% of Iranian university students in a study could properly explain the greenhouse gas effect. They really didn't know about climate change either. And so when you're going to this issue where people of color are being disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, people in the Middle East, and so it really, I feel like it is the international populations, it's our responsibility to make sure that they're educated on these issues that are really affecting them in such a negative way. And so that's what Climate Cardinals is trying to accomplish, because at the end of the day, also climate activists, we need to be a diverse coalition. We need to have representation from all areas across the world. We need to have a diverse array of experiences with climate change in order to properly advocate on behalf of like aggressive legislation that's going to actually fix the issues in our communities. And so that's what we're working on. We also recently just established a chapter system so that people in any area of the world can establish a chapter in their own community and do very specific translations about climate that's affecting their community rather than like right now, for instance, we partnered with like the UNEP and we're translating information about how important it is to protect biodiversity. And so we know that people have very specific translations needs, which is why we've established our chapter system.
Great, and thank you for being here.
I'm sorry I have to hop off. It's been so great.
No, you hit
all
the hour. That's all we asked from you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care. All right, so we're going to come back after that to Naisha for your second question. And this is again about keeping with the theme of like helping those who have already kind of been displaced. And so your question is, it is an unfortunate reality, or at least a serious likelihood, that climate displaced people from small island states will not post-migration be able to return home. And at that point, one of the most important objectives becomes attempting to preserve their cultural links. So from your perspective, both as a person raised in a Caribbean household and as a professional artist, how can art be used to uphold these kinds of cultural practices in displaced communities? And what can receiving states and the international community do to help?
Okay, I had to unmute myself, sorry. Yeah, so first off, I wanted to just say thank you for this question. Thank you for bringing art into the conversation. As an Afro-Caribbean artist developing my practice, I focus mainly on the shared cultural links and experiences between Caribbean, African, and African American cultures, as well as trying to point out the disadvantages that Black and Brown bodies face against climate change and the system that was built to oppress those very bodies. To answer your question, I will start by saying that not only do many of us call these islands our home, but we have deeply rooted cultural and ancestral ties to the land and to the people. We constantly have to think about our homes being washed away. Imagine waking up one day and like not having your home and or having to abandon your home, or your family members and your friends are gone. It's a reality I wouldn't wish on anyone, but a reality that many islanders have to face as climate change continues to worsen. I started to see a heavy influence of my culture show up in my art as I started to take it more seriously. Artists naturally tend to respond to the environment that's around them. Artists' works reflects the world around them, what they see, what they hear, what they experience growing up, economic and social status, and family dynamics. It all shows up in some way, shape, or form. Something that always shows up in my work is a mask as a form of that as identity, a connection I try to make between my Caribbean and my African background. And this stems from the cultural festivals that I participated from childhood to this day. This is an example of how I use my art to uphold my own cultural practices. And many artists of the diaspora tackle these same concepts in different ways and forms and mediums. One thing I will say about people of the African Caribbean diaspora is that during our darkest moments, we never lose hope, and most importantly, we never lose our sense of community. Hurricane Maria may have destroyed the dynamics and the physical layout of the land, but it didn't destroy the spirit of the people of the Puerto Rican country. Black and brown and indigenous people are resilient people. We have endured a history of struggle and resistance that is unmatched, and through it all, we've been able to uphold our cultural practices that grounds us and traces back to our African heritage. No matter where we are, our greatest advantage is our ability to practice social cohesion and build community. We take care of each other, and that extends beyond the island that we're on. To give some examples, after Haiti gained its independence, it helped other countries around gain their independence as well. After Hurricane Dorian and hit the Bahamas last year in 2019, Puerto Rico quickly mobilized to help their Caribbean neighbors to the north, 2 years after Hurricane Maria hit. How is it that a US colony can come to a country's aid while rebuilding faster than the countries that are responsible for the hurricanes, are responsible for climate change getting worse and worse? Well, it's because we look out for each other and we understand that no one will help us better than ourselves. So to go back to the end of your question, which was how can receiving states internationally help countries, right? Well, they can support and aid a just transition within frontline communities. Now, that doesn't mean helicopter into communities and tell them how to rebuild and for a climate adaptable life, but it means to provide the resources they need to rebuild themselves. It means to stand in solidarity and call out developers and governments that try to exploit their land. In 2017, when Maria hit Puerto Rico, Our Power PR, a grassroots initiative co-founded by Uphold, united the Puerto Rican diaspora here in New York around a shared platform to address the injustice the U.S. government response to the humanitarian crisis demanded self-determination and sovereignty and ensure the just recovery to and transition from a regenerative economy. This initiative was developed in response to what organizers on the ground in PR said they needed. Whatever they asked for, whether it was seeds, generators, bikes, canned food, we sent it. And that's the meaning of true solidarity. To support those who are migrating to the States, other countries can support by creating programs that could support the migrants in their transition. But most importantly, just treat them how you would want to be treated in a time of need. Treat them how you would want to be treated if you were a migrant that was forced to move into a state or to a country that you don't know, that you probably don't have family in, that you're struggling to provide for your own family. Treat them how you would want to be treated in that time of need.
Great, and thank you for that answer. And finally, we're going to come back to Dr. Villani. I swear I did not do this on purpose to have you be the first and the last speaker. It just happened that way. But thank you for your patience. And I'm hoping we can end this on something of a positive note. So my question for you is, the Taitiota case might be a breakthrough in the legal protection of climate migrants. So what can we learn from that ruling? What can we keep from it? And what challenges remain in granting migrants protection on environmental grounds, such as highlighted by the UN Human Rights Committee? And also, I didn't ask you this before, and I should have, but could you elaborate a bit on what this case is for people who don't know?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, the case originates from the action brought by Mr. Taitiota, a citizen from the Republic of Kiribati in the Pacific Oceans of the South. So a region which is particularly affected by the sea level rising. And he and his family sought for protection in New Zealand. But actually, at internal level, this protection was not given in the second place. So Mr. Taitiota decided to challenge the decision, the intended decision of the courts, the internal courts, before the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations by claiming the violation of the right to life that is enshrined in Article 6 of the Covenant on Human Rights of the United Nations. What the committee did, the committee actually dismissed the communication, so dismissed the decision of Mr. Taitiota to claim these the internal decisions. But actually, it was quite interesting, the reasoning proposed by the committee, because the committee decided to establish, as I mentioned before, a strict connection between the right to life and the principle of non-refoulement. What is the principle of non-refoulement? The principle of non-refoulement is a very important principle of international law, which establishes the fact that a state cannot refoul a person who can be exposed to a serious risk to life in the country of origin. So the idea to link the fact that Mr. Tetiota could be affected by serious damages to his life when returning at home, and so applying the principle of non-refoulement can be considered a very important step forward in what I previously said, that is the invocation of human rights instruments for the protection of environmental migrants. So this is, I can say, the most interesting point that can be also read in the light of the recent documents adopted at international level, like the Global Compact on Migration, which actually stresses exactly this, the fact that people must be respected in their right to life and not degrading treatment. So this is the reason why it should be guaranteed a sort of protection to these people in situations of difficulty and serious suffering. But I think also that this decision has some problems. In particular, 3 problems I can see. First of all, the fact that the committee's decision confirms that a special protection status because of environmental factors can be granted just when there are actual threats to life. So existing threats to life. It cannot be proposed protection for future and potential events. And this is the reason why Mr. Tetiota's communication was disclaimed, because he, yes, could be affected, but in the future by the sea level rising in its island. So there was not an actual threat. So it must be established this important link between the individual situation and the existence of a threat. This is the first point that is not easy to establish in a situation of climate change, clearly. Difference, I think, is the point on environmental migration, if we think about fast onset events. The second point is the fact that, according to the committee, in order to apply the principle of non-refoulement, it is necessary that the state of origin is unwilling and incapable to take positive measures to ensure the right to life. So, again, it comes on what the other panelists said. It is necessary, and this was also stressed in the Global Compact, it is necessary to stress the opportunity that the countries of origin take adaptation measures against climate change. So we see that this is the first test that must be respected to be granted with the principle of non-refoulement. It is essentially that the application of the right to life and the non-refoulement principle is applied as a last resort instrument. So when other kind of measures of protection are not possible. And so this is, again, in our context, that also the other panelists described, is not very easy, because clearly states have maybe adaptation strategies. The problem is on their implementation generally. The third point that I see quite problematic is the fact that, according to the committee, is the claimant that has the burden to demonstrate not only the fact that it has a real risk of being deprived of its life, but also the fact that he had to leave the country of origin. So the burden of proof is quite, again, complicated to be demonstrated. So I think that this case, which is very important, I think, in particular for the future perspectives it brings. It also stresses two important points. The fact that, on the one hand, we have to stress states' responsibilities in guarantee their citizens' protection by adopting adaptation strategies and all the measures and the policies, also at regional level, that can foster the protection of citizens against a climate change situation. But on the other side, this decision stresses also that states are oriented in guaranteed, even though has a last resort, a sort of protection to these people. And in this sense, I would just conclude my answer with a reference to a very recent decision of the Italian Court of Appeal concerning the granting of a special protection, humanitarian protection, to a citizen, a Senegalese citizen, because he, whether he returned in Senegal, he could be affected by serious problems because of droughts and serious damages to the harvest. And so the Italian court decided to guarantee, to give protection, to grant protection to this claimant by applying the humanitarian visas. So this is quite important because for the first time at a national level, an appeal court decided to extend the notion of humanitarian protection to environmental issues. And maybe I can say that the orientation of the international community is also to rely on national levels in different perspectives in terms of protection ex ante and protection ex post. Okay.
Great, and thank you for that. And that was all of my questions for our panelists. So if this were a better year and we were in person, I would have told the audience to give you all a round of applause. If the people watching at home want to do that anyway, I can't and won't stop you. But we did go over, and Alonso, I know you're watching, so you were right. We should have reserved 90 minutes, not 60. But for the panelists who are still here, do you guys have time to stick around for questions, or do any of you need to dip?
Sure.
Cool.
Sure. I'm good.
All right. So then we'll start with a question for Kaylee. And it is a point states usually stress not to improve the discussion on protection on environmental grounds is the existence of a sort of internal protection in the country of origin of the environmentally affected person. A good solution to this issue would be to enhance data on environmental disasters and impacts on countries as a whole. So do you have any suggestions for how states could enhance data or have better data, essentially?
Actually, I think there's a lot of states that do a relatively good job at collecting data on disasters. You have a lot of states who have a history of disaster, like Japan, that has like 500-year plus records of tsunamis. You have a place like Bangladesh that has 200 years of records of floods. And so I think actually what's more important than that is the impact of those disasters on populations within the country. So, for instance, telling you that a cyclone is a Category 5 cyclone tells you one thing about it. It's strong. It means wind speed is very strong. And that's usually very destructive. But on occasion, what can be even more destructive, and this was seen with Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, for example, as Aisha mentioned, this was even seen with Hurricane Laura in the Gulf recently, is the amount of time that it stalls over locations is actually much more impactful in some cases. So I think a more varied or nuanced understanding of the types of impacts that actually affect communities will be important. But it also, as a part of this equation, we need to actually consult with the community it's impacted itself, because they know more than any other just to what degree that kind of disaster is impactful. So there's some good examples of work already being done on this, especially on impacts related to climate change. So Hindu Omar Ibrahim is actually leading work in her country, Chad, with indigenous peoples to basically survey them and have them track to what degree different types of environmental disasters or climatic change is happening within their communities. And they're able to see it tangibly within a degree that's much more accurate than any sort of, climate scientist, for example. So I think it's a layered response, but I think there are better ways to go about doing it, and those would be the first two ways I would explore.
Great, thank you. So we've got one question for Zanaji and Naisha, and I think Zanaji will have you answer first, and then Naisha you'll take second. But the question for you guys is, in your opinion, what can young people do to engage their communities in the debate on environmental migration?
Sure. So I think that there are a ton of things that young people can do. First being, you can get involved with an organization. So 0 Hour, we operate in the US nationally, but we have chapters around the world. And you can do climate justice education work with us. We deliver a presentation called Getting to the Roots of Climate Change on the 4 different systems of repression that I named that are affecting people and have been a cause of climate change. You can inform communities and get involved with our chapters and do that work. And I know Sophia also mentioned with Climate Cardinals, they also have chapters around the world. And there are many different environmental organizations operating in different countries. So find what issue that you're most passionate about and then go from there. And if you're particularly interested in environmental migration, there are also ways to demonstrate that. You can highlight stories. We find at 0 Hour that storytelling is one of the best ways to create an empathetic audience, to get people on board with supporting an issue. And so if you know anyone who has been displaced or is an environmental migrant, you can highlight their story in whatever work that you're already doing. And then I'll also mention political organizing is another way to get involved. We right now are leading a campaign called #VoteForOurFuture, which is all about getting young people, especially, and people who will be most impacted by climate change and environmental justice issues here in the US, to go to the polls in November for our presidential election with climate change as a top priority. And so they are using that hashtag to show that but even around the world, you can use that hashtag as well. I know that we are working on it for the US election, but if you have any election coming up right now or a future election and you plan to vote for our future and vote with climate change in mind, you can do that and share your story about why you care so much about these issues, why you will engage and highlight the stories of people who are environmental migrants, and join us in this work.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just jump on that question as well. It's of course we should definitely get involved. Uprose is a part of CJA, which is the Climate Justice Alliance, and we have tons of members across the US and Puerto Rico and Guam that do this work, that are on the ground, frontline communities that are doing the work. So you can find young people of color doing the work all across the US. And if you are interested, definitely get involved. One thing I'll also say is that it needs to be spoken about more. Usually climate migration or migration in general is sometimes talked in a negative light. It should definitely be talked more in a positive light. It should be talked more with compassion and love for people. As humans, we should share compassion and love for people, whether we live amongst them or if they're in a different country or if they're across the world. You know, we should have some kind of compassion to what struggles that they're going to, and that should be practiced and learned amongst all people. So yeah, definitely we need to talk more about it within our communities and also make it relatable. It's happening right here in the US. Displacement is happening in the US due to climate change, due to natural disasters. Look at California. New York, we're experiencing hurricanes. That doesn't happen in New York. Sandy displaced a lot of New York people. Many of them having to move out of New York, many of them moving out of where they grew up for years. So make it relatable. Make sure that they understand that this could happen to anyone. It can happen to you. So you should care about these issues.
Great, thank you. And we'll end with one final question for Dr. Villani. So, Professor, do you see soft law instruments as a suitable way to address challenges such as climate change and migration? And what are the pros and cons of soft law? And also, what is soft law for people who don't know?
Exactly. I guess that was the question. What is soft law? Well, soft law, I think that Chiara was thinking about the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees, as well as the agendas for sustainable development and so on. These are examples of soft law, especially in the field of climate change and migration. Why? Because they are not binding documents. They are agreed by the majority of the states of the international community, but they do not establish obligations on the contractual parties. This is the definition of soft law. What is, in general, the importance of soft law? So why the states adopt this kind of documents that do not have a legal consequence? Actually, for two different points, two different goals. First of all, soft law instruments are intended to stress the orientation of the international community on a specific topic. And this is also what the Global Compacts do in this case, because the Global Compacts on migration in general, refugees on the other one, stress what is the orientation of the member states of the international community in this specific topic. So this is actually the first point. The second point is more practical and also more positive, because soft law instruments, even though are not binding, they can push for the establishment of customary international law. Because these documents are important for elaborating the opinio juris, so the idea that a specific behavior or a specific obligation must be introduced at international level. So it is a first step for the elaboration of international law, and so for binding rules at the end. So I think that for answering to Chiara, soft law instruments are important also in this field for these reasons that I mentioned, more specifically because they are a starting point for elaborating a common vision on something that has Zanaghi, for example, said, but also Kylie, that migration and climate change are global problems, which can affect anyone. So I would say that in this regard, we couldn't divide the North and the South global. Because Zanaghi, for example, explained the situation in Alaska or in Groenlandia. So we can't divide the world in a classical way. And this is, I think, also an important issue for stressing the different with in comparison to the refugee approach, because the refugees clearly are linked to specific situations of war, of conflicts, of persecutions, which can be limited to some specific dimensions and countries. But migration and climate change must be viewed and seen with according to an extensive perception. And this is the reason why I think that these documents adopted at international level are very important, because for the first time, even though they are not establishing obligations, but the nexus between climate change, environmental issues, and migration was established. So maybe it could be a first step forward. And secondly, as already said for answering to the previous question, these soft law instruments indicates two points. So the necessity to stress again on the state responsibility and at regional level, maybe measure cooperation in these fields. And on the other hand, the necessity to take into consideration a broader interpretation on human rights instruments. So I think that they can be valid and important for these reasons.
All right, thank you so much. And that is well beyond all the time we have here today. So thank you to all of our speakers. We could not have done this without you, and we appreciate you being here on such short notice. Use my last 30 seconds here to say universal end for immigration detention and for deportation across the world, and here in the US, abolish ICE and defund the police. And I hope you all have a great rest of your days. And since I am in California, I'm going to go back to sleep. And I will hopefully speak to you all again soon. And thank you once more for being here. So everyone take care.
Thank you,
Kyle.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.